Greetings and welcome to another lecture in comparative psychology. This one is more on the lighter side than some of the earlier ones. This chapter involves play. Now, play is a behavior that is so common in humans and also very common in other animals that we don't necessarily think about it, but it has been the source of a lot of discussion and debate and conjecture as to exactly what might be going on here when we talk about animals playing. So, play in non-human animals. Play can take a lot of forms. It's difficult sometimes to tell what is play and what isn't, and in fact we're going to talk about that quite a bit. Individuals can play by themselves, they can play with others, they can play with other species in some cases. It also involves many species of animals. Your book has a fascinating chart about what animals play and what animals don't. If we're looking at, for instance, where play is most common, we're essentially talking mammals and birds. But some turtles and tortoises play. Some other reptiles play. Frogs and toads may play, although salamanders and newts, fellow amphibians, don't. Some fish play. Some sharks play. I mean, it's really kind of interesting. It can be difficult sometimes to tell, as I mentioned, what is play because it can be, kind of difficult to tell the difference between play and hunting or whatnot. But it does appear that play is more common in the larger-brained vertebrates. So, yeah, we're talking mammals in particular, but also birds. Birds, of course, are closely related to reptiles. There's some discussion that birds are actually feathered reptiles that are also warm-blooded. But they do indeed play. Lots of birds do. Now, play is also a behavior, as far as we can tell, that tends to occur during low-stressed conditions. Animals don't spend a lot of time playing when they're under a lot of stress or they're freaking out or they're being hunted or they're otherwise, basically, they don't have the time. It's possible that play is due, particularly in adults, is due to maybe boredom. They get bored. There's nothing to do. They don't need to hunt. They don't need to defend a territory. They don't need to travel. So what do? They play. Which may also be why younger animals are more likely to play, since younger animals are more likely to be taken care of by their parents. But that is, there's also other reasons why younger animals might play that we're going to get into. I mentioned this was an area of some conjecture, and in fact there's not a lot of research on play. It's only very recently that a lot of zoologists decided that animals do indeed play, that they play the same way humans play. They do it for fun and not for a real reason like getting food or something. Remember, it's only relatively recently that we've started considering that non-human animals might have things like emotions. And there are some today that still don't think that that is true. So there's not a lot of research yet on play. So this is not going to be one of the longer chapters, but researchers are working on it. Now, one of the big problems with play and the lack of research with play was quite simply that it's really difficult to come up with a good definition of it. Because normally we define behavior by its function. What does it do? And play doesn't seem to have a function, And when we're talking non-human animals, researchers aren't likely to say, the function is they're bored, simply because, as I mentioned before, most zoologists don't like to get into that whole animals having emotions things, at least up and not until recently. And a lot of the data we had is anecdotal. It's stories. And a lot of scientists don't basically, they don't lend much credence to anecdotal stories for the good reason that anything can happen in stories. Stories can be exaggerated. People can be lying. And so when we're talking about really, serious scientific observation of play, there hasn't been a lot of it. And so researchers have tried to come up with a definition, because in a lot of ways that's the first step. We have to come up with a definition. And here is a fun definition that appears to be the one that is mostly accepted at the moment. And the definition essentially is that play is any behavior that doesn't have a function. It's any behavior that's purposeless. It doesn't have a function. It's not involved directly in, finding food or eating food or finding mates or mating with mates or taking care of offspring or defending territory. It doesn't seem to have a purpose. It doesn't seem to have a function. It's the none of the above category. And a lot of times in science, none of the above categories aren't particularly good, and this one lives up to that because sometimes this definition doesn't work. For instance, a number of animals in captivity or that are otherwise deprived of being able to live their normal lives will start to do behaviors that have no purpose, but they certainly don't seem to be play. Your book talks about like animals in a zoo pacing. They just pace back and forth and pace back and forth. It certainly doesn't look fun, that pacing. And it doesn't have a purpose, though, because they're just walking back and forth, sometimes to the point where they will wear a path in the grass or wear a path wherever that is they're walking. And when behaviors are like that, when they're repetitive behaviors, when they're doing the same thing over and over and over again, it's often called stereotypy. And it's usually a sign in animals in captivity that they are being deprived of anything of interest in their environment. We'd see a lot of stereotypy in animals that were in the old style cages where, excuse me, there's basically nothing for them to do. Where there was very little for them to play with. It was basically them, oftentimes in a cage with bars set up so that people would be able to see them at all times, because that's what the people are there for. And so very often you would wind up with the pacing animals or with animals just performing behaviors. I was at a zoo once and they had an otter, and the otter would swim through its small tank, basically do a backflip, swim back, jump out of the water, run a little bit, turn around, and do the same thing. It wasn't having fun. It certainly didn't look like it was having fun. And the behavior didn't vary at all. It was the same behavior over and over and over, and the animal didn't seem to want or even perhaps be able to stop it. And that's an example of stereotypy. It's that same behavior. Very often, by the way to deal with stereotypy is actually to put something in the environment that the animal can interact with. It's why pretty much all reputable zoos these days, or places that keep animals in captivity anyway, they give something for the animals to do. It's called enrichment. And it can either be hiding their food in various places, or giving them toys, or varying their environment. Or when I was working with dolphins, we would put a lot of toys in when we weren't working with them to give the dolphins something to play with. I have seen places where, for instance, they'll when they feed their large carnivores like their big cats, they won't just throw the food at them. They'll go in and they'll hide it. Or they'll freeze some of the food, so the animal has to deal with the frozen food with the ice, which is kind of different. I've seen, places in that have polar bears that'll throw in like 50-pound blocks of ice into their water habitats, and the bears will just play with those. Or they will take food and put it, inside of a bone or inside of something sturdy, so the animal has to extract it. It gives the animal something to do. And when you give the animal something to do, you see a lot less of this stereotypy. So it's basically defined as, it's making the animal happier in some ways. And in fact, I went back to see the same otter later on, and they had altered its environment. They had given its toys, they had moved everything around, and there was very little of that stereotypic behavior. The otter really was, interacting with its environment differently. It wasn't just doing the same behavior over and over and over again. And it looked, speaking as an anecdote and speaking as, in a non-scientific fashion, that animal sure as heck looked a lot happier. It looked like it was having fun. It looked like it was enjoying itself. So I'm very glad that they put that in. And that's why, like I said, most reputable zoos and places with animals in captivity will do that. Even domesticated animals. It's good for them to have toys. It's good for them to have something to do. It's good for them to not be bored. And if it's possible for them to be able to exercise some of those instincts they have in the play, to play with these things, to have that functionless behavior, but that might be related to a function, more about that when we talk about the possible purpose of play, then that is all for the better.